Hi, Misha here, and today we're going to talk about the most exciting topic in the world. French pistols. Okay, don't click off yet. Or maybe, I don't know. But, I don't know. I haven't really had these out in a while, and just kind of felt like talking about them. This is the SACM, SACM 1935A. This was originally to be the standard gun. And this is the Mle.1935S, which was adopted as a substitute standard, although really wasn't produced until after World War II. Both of these are chambered by 7.65 long, 7.65-20, which is actually a development of the US's 30 Petter cartridge for the 1903 Mark I. Interesting story there. We'll talk about it. And we'll get into some mechanics and what have you of these guns. You might find them, more interesting than you thought. So with that, let's get into the history. You know me, and you know that I feel that history is very important for understanding the why of things, and that's especially true for the 1935 pistols. These are a direct result of their history. In World War I, France used a lot of different handguns. The 1892 revolver here, an 8mm, often called the Lebel revolver, but it's not, ordnance revolver from MAS, was the standard issue, but its cartridge was relatively anemic, and automatics were becoming more of a thing. And this was the closest France had to a standard automatic in World War I, the Spanish Ruby pistol. Various factories in Spain, 40 or 50 at the end, would build these. And they would build roughly 1 million, and of those, roughly 700,000 were delivered to France, and of those, majority were issued to French and French colonial units, firing 7.65 by 17, 7.65 Browning, 32 auto. It was a heavy yet robust gun, which was a simplified version of a Browning. They also had some Savage pistols and others we can talk about in another video. After the war, beginning around 1921, France just started talking about new rifles and grenades and other fun things, but a new handgun was a very little priority. And in the beginning, when they were kind of tossing ideas around, they were talking 9mm. And we can today usually assume 9mm means 9x19 Parabellum Luger. And it might have done. They were aware of the round. But I wanted to bring this out for a moment because the Swedish 1907, based on the FN 1903, is in a different 9mm, 9x20, which for a time was a very powerful handgun cartridge, an direct blowback gun, concealed hammer, what have you. It's possible they were looking at other 9mm options besides 9x19. But in 1927, that changed, and this gun is why. This is my Springfield 1903 Mark I with the cutout for the Pedersen device, which was a small device to convert this to fire a small 30 caliber semi-pistol round, basically a pistol round, but a little more oomphy. And as you know, they started to build these, but they never really went into operations in World War I, and that was kind of the end of it. But the French liked this round. Now, we have to point out that 30 Pedersen was pretty anemic, but still more than a, 32 like in the Rube. And so they developed it into 7.65 long, which was 7.65 by 20. So essentially taking the 9mm from this and pairing it with this. And you notice the ejection port is actually very, very similar to that on the 1935. And the reason they did that wasn't so much the handgun, but they were first considering going to their full first submachine gun, and they felt this would be a good submachine gun round. They weren't wrong, really. Obviously, you want your handgun and submachine gun to use the same cartridge, so from this point, that's really the major consideration. So in 1930, it was announced for the first time to have full trials to pick a new service sidearm to replace aging and outdated handguns that were actually honestly no longer in production in France. And these would be held in 1933. And many designs were submitted, over 20, and of those, 11 were in the new 7.65 long cartridge. They would test other cartridges, but it was, by those in the know and those actually serious about winning the contract, they would rework their guns to fire that. No winner was picked in 1933. And really, this was kind of more of a technology demonstration. See what's out there, see what we would want, what we do like, what we don't like. And from that, the commission really ironed out the wrinkles, and they decided that they wanted a single action only with exposed hammer, that they wanted a manual safety that could physically block the striker, i.e. firing pin, on the slide. They specified that. Magazine disconnect safety was important too. They wanted something very simple and easy to disassemble. In fact, they pretty much wanted it where once you pulled out the slide stop, they went that far to specify exactly how. The whole gun would just come apart without tools. Because before this, they really weren't encouraging individual soldiers to take apart their guns for cleaning and maintenance. Now they wanted to, kind of following that same idea. They wanted a removable trigger hammer pack, kind of like the early Tokarev, the 1930, and of course carried on to the 1933 Tokarevs. And they wanted to have as few parts as possible, using the same springs where possible. And they really just kind of refined what they wanted. And the next round of trials were announced in 1934 to commence in the spring of 1935. And really, there were only 4 serious entries. It wasn't officially specified or required, but by this point, it was clear that the French were kind of enamored with the Browning link tipping barrel system found in like the 1911. So it's kind of no surprise that the 4 guns that contended really had a lot in common with Browning's designs, although to be fair, most handguns did at the time. One of the 4 was similar to this. This is my Star. It came from Spain, from the company that would become Star, and it was a clone copy of the 1911. It made sense since Spain had had good success selling the Ruby to France. Then, of course, the High Power, a Browning Sasov design from FN. And then we would have designs from the State Arsenal, MAS, Saint-Etienne, and SACM, the company, which actually while they were producing it, really started off as a design from Charles Petter. So those are the 4, and they were chambered in 7.65 long. The first to get knocked out, and relatively quickly, was the Spanish design. I don't think they were really very serious about it. But again, the company would go on to produce the Star, which would be adopted as the Model A by the Spanish in the 40s, and the Model B for export. That left these 3. They really did like the High Power, but let's be honest, they knew early on they were going to go with the design from France. Well, sort of. So the High Power was kind of reluctantly knocked out by 1936. So by 1936-37, we have 2 designs left. MAS and SACM. Now the SACM design is interesting. Charles Petter was actually born in Switzerland, but he fought for the French Foreign Legion in World War I, became a captain, and was actually given French citizenship. And he was interested in handguns, kind of working on them in his spare time in the 1920s. And once his job kind of left him, in 1933 he took his ideas to SACM and was hired on as kind of their chief engineer. And he applied for a patent in March of 1944, which would be granted just over a year later in 1935. The MAS design was a continuation of what they had submitted in 1933, just further improvements. And the reason these guns have so much in common is because they were both designed to meet the requirements of the competition. In the end, the SACM header design was selected, and that was made official in 1937, and the first order placed, and the first pistols were delivered to the military in October of that year for testing. Unfortunately, two problems were soon very apparent. One, SACM was a small company and was not going to be able to meet the requirements for production. Not on time, anyway. Two, testing revealed issues. So a couple of commissions were set up, one from the Versailles committee that had selected the gun, another from the infantry and the army, to review the guns and make suggestions. They did this throughout 1938, and in 1939 they gave a list of suggestions to SACM of how to improve things, mostly to do with things like better metallurgy, improved, more modernized heat treatment, and just overall better machining. And these suggestions would really fix most of the issues. However, by this point, this gun would come into play. This was officially adopted as the Mle.1935A, sometimes also known as the PA.1935A or just PA.35A, PA standing for basically pistol automatic. This would be the runner-up in the competition. However, when it was clear that the SACM guns would not be available and the numbers wanted and all that stuff, December 29, 1937, and this was officially adopted as the Mle.1935S, PA.35S, is kind of a substitute standard backup fallback gun, and they are very similar in a lot of ways. And in September of 1938, an order for 10,000 was placed with MAS, and the first were delivered in 1939 around February. Both guns are about 7.75 inches long. Both have a barrel at 4.3 inches. Both have an 8-round magazine, 7.65 long. Both are single action. In fact, dimensionally, they're very close in weight, too. This is just a hair under 26 ounces, and this is about 25.5 ounces. So the S is a half ounce lighter. And because of the requirements, both have manual safety. Keep in mind, this is the M1 safety. We'll talk about that later, which physically blocks the hammer. Both have a magazine disconnect. Two grip panels. One neat thing to point out, they both have a bushingless slide/barrel and a captive recoil spring. Improvements kind of on the original Browning idea, just to make things simpler. Both are single action only. Both have Browning style mag catches. By the way, these originally did not have lanyard loops. These were added later for police, but the S did. The original production 35As pre-war were often blued with a small number phosphated, but the most common finish was a baked-on enamel lacquer coating, which was actually first pioneered for the French Navy by FN, a coating they really liked. The S's were phosphated originally. with that, yeah, let's take these apart, because they are very similar, but they are different in kind of interesting ways too. Now, broad strokes, these are very similar because they were both designed specifically for the 1933-1935 trial periods. But in the details, they are different. They're both takes on the Browning tilting tipping link barrel system, but they do have a different way of going about it. They're also both single action only, 8-round magazines, although the mags are not interchangeable. Set these aside here. And one of the requirements was very easy disassembly by pushing out the stop here. Nothing really of note, although this does of course have that removable trigger pack, kind of from the Tokrev we talked about. But the difference is actually in the link up here in the recoil spring. Let me take the other one apart and I'll show you. This one comes apart similar, but a little different. You actually want to pull this back. Actually put my mag back in, make it a little faster, I think. To where it's open. And then press this out, because this one needs, the catch needs to be a little bit up to come out. Very similar rails, all that. I'm really going to try to mix those parts up. That'll be fun. Now looking at these, you'll notice this is a single link system with a captive recoil spring. This is a different type of captive spring with a hole in it. That's where the pin goes through, and this has 2 links. Is there an advantage or disadvantage? I don't know. This would seem to be simpler, easier to make. And also the lockup. This is very Browning style. We have these 2 grooves in the barrel that correspond to the slide for lockup. This is a little different. Notice there's no grooves. That's because this actually locks directly into the ejection port, not unlike, say, a modern Glock or other modern pistol. And what's really interesting, because of the 7.65 long cartridge, some debate if a locked breech was even necessary, but both did happen. Move on. So back together and back at the table. One thing that's kind of interesting, the SACM started off slow, but by the time the Germans invaded and the armistice was declared in June of 1940, 10,700 had been delivered. Alternatively, even though the 35S was brought in because they needed more, just over 1,400 had been delivered. Not because there was any issue, but because the MAS factory was so busy with other projects, including one from Charles Petter. Remember how I said in the beginning they picked this cartridge, 7.65 long, because of submachine guns? Well, Charles Petter would go on to design France's first fully adopted mass-produced submachine gun, the MAS-38. So it was ramping up for production in 1939. And the cartridge, while many would call it anemic by today's standards, it was quite a bit more powerful than a standard 7.65 32 auto. But it wasn't on the level of, say, 7.62 Tokrev. Just one of those things. But that shows you that between the two of them, only about 12,000 were in service in the early days of World War II. And during World War II, under Nazi occupation, one would continue in production and use, and the other would not. In 1940, both the MAS factory and the SACM factory would fall under German authority occupation. However, the 35S would not be kept or retained or put into production. We don't really know why. Stories say that the workers there hid the plans. Could have been. Could have also just been that it was in a relatively obscure and new caliber that Germany wasn't terribly interested in. On the other hand, the 35A was retained for production, with the first ones delivered under Nazi occupation in October of 1940. And these would be designated as the pistol, the P625-625F. And they were still in the 7.65 long. And common lore has it that because of the weird cartridge, that these were mostly issued to troops stationed within France, which would make sense. So police and security and all that stuff. They would actually produce 23,850 for the Germans. Early ones would have the Eagle 655 mark. Later you get the WAA 251 mark. Just the different inspectors. And the last ones were delivered in April of 1944. Quality was kept relatively high. No real changes were made. Yeah, so you can find Waffen amps on 35As, but if you see them on 35S pistols, it's a fake. Deep Space Nine reference. Serial numbers. Similar to the Germans, the French did blocks of 10,000 for these guns. Unlike the Germans, it started out without a prefix and then rolled over to A after 10,000 guns were built. The French started off with A, 10,000, then B, and then up to 10,000, and so on and so forth, more or less sequentially, at least for the 35A. Yeah, they started off with A0001 and all the way through I, into the I block. I know technically that means there were 9,999 guns, not 10,000. That discrepancy is something people debate about all the time. I don't know. I wasn't there. So the A's are pretty easy to date by their serial number. The S's get a little more convoluted. They use the same system, but different factories would use different prefixes. For example, MF and would have its own range in the G block, and then SAGEM would have a start over with a new fresh A block. And then MAS would lead into MAC, which would actually pick up in the middle of the F block. It's a thing. We'll talk about all these different makers. Because multiple companies made the 35S, yeah, serials get a little more interesting. In fact, MAS even made some without a prefix at all. Yeah. So more going on here. On the other hand, at least with the A, you've got pre-war, and then you've got wartime Nazi-proofed, and then you've got post-war. So there's some kind of cool variations and markings there. With that, let's move on. After liberation, 1944, both pistols were back in production. The first A's under new Free French were delivered around October, and were in the D prefix block, whereas the 35S's would start up at MAS with either no prefix at all or in the F block. And these would continue to be phosphated pretty well unchanged. Now, MAS would only build about 6,900 of these pistols total. So 1,400 before the war, and then we have, 5,400 immediately after the war in 1944 into 45. But again, they were very busy, government arsenal. They were building the new 1944 self-loading rifle, and France felt like it needed small arms to regain control of its colonies, so production would actually be contracted out to other firms. The A, on the other hand, would continue at SACM throughout, and they would build another 50,400 with the last pistol leaving the factory February 10, 1950. So these were only ever built there. I think it was in the I prefix block. But it's interesting. Pre-war, this was the gun featured in manuals and stuff because it was meant to be the standard. But post-war, the 35S gained more attention. In fact, it would remain in training manuals longer than the 35A. Again, they're so close in specifications and features, I don't know that it really matters, but there you have it. So, use would continue into the post-war era, and even production for a time. So let's wrap things up by talking about the latter days of this gun, and really how its cartridge is what ultimately held it back and led to its replacement. The 35A story is pretty consistent, and very few changes were introduced to the design because it was made by one factory and pretty consistent run. They would build just under 85,000. So that was that. Even though production was over by 1950, they would still have a lot of them in inventory in 1957, tens of thousands, and they would keep parts on standby to refurbish existing guns. The 35S, though, has a more interesting story with a lot of changes. For various reasons, this just became kind of the de facto small gun for the military and police in the post-war era. Like I said, MAS would build some during World War II, but they really were too busy. Now mine here is marked MF, which is the first subcontractor. 10,000 were assembled by them using components supplied by MAS. They would finish them out between very late 1944 and October of 1945. Like I said, 10,000, and these would have MFG prefixed serials, and they are phosphated. The next subcontractor was a company, SACM, SACM, and they were contracted with in 1945, and they would build more parts on their own, producing 10,000 guns with A prefix serials, with the last of those leaving the factory in 1951. They would use subcontracted barrels from MAP, which actually got them into a little bit of trouble. Turns out, of the 10,000 guns produced, roughly 500 had out-of-spec barrels. So these had to be reworked by our third factory and were turned out in 1953 and actually used by internal security in prison. Now the SACM guns had several finishes. They could be blued, they could be phosphated, or they could have that enamel type finish on them. Kind of interesting, and you do see some of those in the USA. But the big one, well, that's MAC. Beginning in late summer of 1945 and kind of rolling through spring of 1946, the 35S production line was transferred from MAS to MAC, and by that year they were up and running. And between that time and 1956, they would build a little over 56,000 of these. And they would use some subcontracted parts, namely from MAT, who would later produce the MAT-49 submachine gun. Things like barrels and slides, some small parts. So you can see some MAT parts on some MAC guns. They also reworked some older guns, like mine here, which has the MAC stamp. That's because MAC made some changes. The 35A's safety flips up, very easily distinguishable, and it folds down into the slide. This was something that the military wanted. Originally, the 35S safety was more toggly. It would flip forward to here and then back to here, on and off. So you couldn't just visually ID looking from the rear as well if it was on. In 1946, Mac reworked it to this style, where it flips up more A-like and is more visually distinctive. Known as the 35S M1, the name first appears in 1947 on new guns, and then they did start pulling older guns in and retrofitting them, with this becoming the standard that all guns should meet by 1950. So you're going to see some reworks there. They also changed the magazine. Definitely drop free. Originally, these had a machined base plate like this one does. They went to a improved, lighter, easier to make stamped base plate. Also, originally it was a two-piece follower with kind of a rivet put into it. They would go to a single piece style. And you can tell an early from a late mag very easily. The early ones have MLE on the bottom, the later ones do not. So yeah, Mac introduced several changes, which makes sense because they built the most of these by far. In total, just under 83,000 35Ss were produced. And with production ending in 56, these are still very much in service in the late 50s and into the 60s. And even while military users would start to switch away from them, police and security and whatnot would continue. Like I said, that's actually why my 35A has a lanyard staple added to the grip. I think that's cool. I actually sought out one with the lanyard. Your mileage may vary. In fact, these would stay in service with the Paris police and others into the 1970s. Ultimately, the reason they were kind of opted away from wasn't so much that they were wearing out or jamming or unreliable or not durable. No, the French police would ultimately have to retire them because they could not get enough ammunition anymore by the 70s. Also, as you know, terrorism and whatnot, communists and all that, were starting to get increasingly problematic in Europe. This is why Germany would end up going to 9mm. So their time was up. And the military had been up for quite a long while, although in the colonies and what have you, Indochina, Algeria, these guns would continue on, and they would get scattered amongst the nations. The French did try to keep them in good working order through 1964-65, and then started to kind of give up on parts and would put them into storage. In the USA, at least 20,000 to 25,000 were imported. However, again, because of the essentially proprietary cartridge, prices have always been pretty low. Now, both of my guns are early post-war serials. This one being E block. Like I said, they picked up post-German with the D block. And this one is MF, which was always in the G block. And those are all produced between, well, basically all of them are made in 1945. Don't know. There are some variations. I've had some blued ones and stuff and whatnot, but most of the variations are with the finish. They are very well made guns and pleasant to shoot, except again, ammo. And it is as famously known, the Charles Petter design, which he patented, was purchased by SIG, which would turn into several prototype guns. I don't know why I picked the wrong one up. Sorry about that. Charles Petter design, based on the 35A. I was just making sure you're still awake. was purchased by SIG in Switzerland, which kind of makes sense because he was originally Swiss. And would lead to a lot of prototypes between 1942 and 1948, becoming first the SP-47, which would turn into the P-210. And we talked about that in the 210 video. Kind of interesting. And back in front of the camera to end things with, I appreciate you hanging out. I just find mechanical things interesting. The 35A, because of being based on what would become the 210, the Charles Petter design, it's very comfortable grip. Ergonomically, it's a very svelte, curvy gun. Very attractive in its own way. The S is very angular. In some ways more futuristic, in some ways more old school. I do like that it does have the kind of more modern rebounding hammer that doesn't go all the way forward unless you have your finger on the trigger, whereas the A, yeah, it has a half cock, but that's about it. Just differences. These are very similar. Magazine disconnect. Actually quite nice trigger even for a magazine disconnect. But I hope this was informative. I just found these pistols interesting. I actually got into them years ago when I met someone who had a major collection of these at our capital, which is Little Rock, and just kind of got taken in by him and his enjoyment of them. Pretty neat. Well, as always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, I promise not to spend all the money on French guns. This is Misha, and catch you very soon next time.